In the golden age of Hollywood, Farley Granger was the heartthrob on screen, and Arthur Laurents was the genius writer behind West Side Story. But behind the red carpet, they were hiding a dangerous secret. In an era where being gay meant career suicide, they refused the studio's demands for fake marriages to women. Along with his lover Arthur Laurents, Farley bravely redeemed his freedom by buying out his contract, accepting the high price to escape the hunter's den, and living happily together for over 50 years. Farley's childhood was defined by the midnight flit, the humiliating ritual of packing up their meager belongings in the dead of night to escape a landlord demanding rent that they did not have. They moved from small apartments to smaller rooms, slipping through the cracks of California society. This instability bred a profound sense of insecurity in the young Farley. He learned early on that safety was an illusion, that the roof over your head could be snatched away by a stranger with a ledger. He became a chameleon, a shy, sensitive boy who retreated into books and daydreams to escape the shame of his family's poverty. He learned to be quiet, to be observant, and to be whatever the adults in the room needed him to be. It was this very quality, this malleable, eager to please vulnerability, that would make him the perfect victim for the studio system. In 1943, the war in Europe and the Pacific was consuming the world, but in Hollywood, the machine needed fresh meat. The older leading men, the Jimmy Stewarts, the Clark Gables, were shipping out to fight, leaving a vacuum that needed to be filled by the young and the beautiful. Farley Granger was 17 years old. He was working in a local theater production in Los Angeles, not out of a burning ambition to be a star, but because he had nowhere else to go. He was raw, he was untrained, but he possessed a quality that cannot be taught. He was beautiful in a way that the camera instinctively loved. A talent scout spotted him, and the machinery of the industry began to turn with terrifying speed. Within days, the 17-year-old boy was summoned to the inner sanctum of the Samuel Goldwyn studio. He was about to meet the man who would become his tormentor, his father figure, and his jailer. Samuel Goldwyn was not merely a movie producer. In the hierarchy of 1940s, Hollywood, he was an emperor. Unlike other moguls who answered to boards of directors in New York, Goldwyn was an independent titan. He answered to no one but his own volatile instincts. He was a Polish Jewish immigrant who had walked across Europe to escape poverty, a man who had built a kingdom out of sheer will and brutality. He was famous for his Goldwinisms, comical misuses of the English language, but there was nothing funny about doing business with him. He was a tyrant. He viewed his actors not as collaborators, but as livestock. He prided himself on discovering talent, which in his mind meant he created them. And because he created them, he believed he owned them. When Farley Granger walked into Goldwyn's office, he was a lamb walking into a slaughterhouse. He had no agent, he had no lawyer. He had only his parents, who were dazzled by the proximity to wealth and the desperate hope that their beautiful son could save the family from financial ruin. Goldwyn looked at the boy, and instead of seeing a person with dreams and fears, he saw a blank canvas. He saw a replacement for the aging stars of the previous generation, a face that could sell millions of tickets. Goldwyn slid a contract across the polished mahogany desk. To a family that had spent years dodging landlords, the numbers on the page looked like a fortune. $100 a week. It was more money than Farley had ever seen, but the dollar figure was the bait. The clauses were the trap. This was the standard 7-year contract, the legal instrument that formed the backbone of the studio system's power. But calling it a contract implies a mutual agreement between two parties. In reality, it was a deed of ownership. The terms were draconian. The contract bound Farley to Samuel Goldwyn Productions for 7 years. However, the commitment was entirely one-sided. The studio held the option. Every 6 months or every year, Goldwyn had the unilateral right to decide whether to keep Farley or fire him. Farley had no such right. Resignation was impossible. He was bound by law to show up whenever Goldwyn called, for whatever role chosen. The restrictions reached deep into his personal autonomy. The exclusivity clauses were suffocating. Farley was barred from working for other studios, appearing on radio, doing commercial endorsements, and, most painfully, acting in the theater. He was legally prohibited from using his own face or voice to earn a living anywhere in the known universe without written permission. And then there was the morality clause. This was the invisible shackle. The clause gave the studio the right to terminate the contract and destroy the actor's career if they engaged in any behavior that could be deemed to bring ridicule, scandal, or disdain upon the company. In the context of the 1940s, this was a loaded weapon pointed directly at the head of any actor who did not conform to the strict, puritanical standards of American society. For a young man like Farley, who was just beginning to understand that his desires did not align with the heterosexual norm, the morality clause was a source of constant, low-level terror. It meant that his private life was not private. It was a breach of contract waiting to happen. Farley signed the paper, his parents signed theirs. The ink dried, and the gate slammed shut. Farley Granger ceased to be a private citizen and became an asset of the corporation. The transformation began immediately. The studio system was an assembly line, and Farley was the raw material. He was sent to the wardrobe department, the makeup chair, the voice coaches. They analyzed his teeth, his walk, his posture. There was a humiliating discussion about changing his name. Goldwyn felt Farley Granger sounded too soft, too British, lacking the punch of a Rock Hudson or a Tab Hunter. Farley, in a rare moment of early defiance, clung to his name. It was the only piece of his old self he was allowed to keep. His debut role was fast-tracked. Goldwyn cast him in The North Star, a massive high-budget war film released in 1943. It was a piece of pro-Soviet propaganda crafted during the brief window when the U.S. and the USSR were allies against Hitler. Farley played a young Russian peasant, a role that required him to look heroic, tragic, and beautiful. On set, the reality of his new life set in. He was surrounded by legends, Walter Huston, Erich von Stroheim, Anne Baxter, but he felt like an imposter. He was terrified. He barely knew where the camera was. He didn't know how to hit his marks. Goldwyn, however, didn't care about Farley's internal terror. He only cared about the dailies. And on screen, Farley was electric. The camera captured his anxiety and read it as intensity. It captured his fear and read it as vulnerability. The film was released and the critical reception was warm. The public noticed him. Fan mail began to arrive in sacks. The studio publicity machine roared into life, manufacturing a biography for him that erased the poverty and the insecurity, replacing it with the shiny veneer of a rising star. They sold him as the boy next door, the wholesome American dream personified. But as the external success grew, the internal vice tightened. Samuel Goldwyn began to exhibit signs of the obsessive control that would define Farley's life for the next decade. Goldwyn didn't just want a star, he wanted a son, a protege, and a puppet. He began to summon Farley to his office for lectures. These weren't professional performance reviews. They were personal critiques that bordered on harassment. Goldwyn would criticize the way Farley dressed in his off hours. He would demand to know why Farley wasn't seen at the right nightclubs, specifically the Mocambo or Kiro's, and He wanted to know why Farley wasn't dating the young actresses the studio pushed at him. There was a dark, unspoken tension in these meetings. Goldwin, a man aggressively proud of his own heterosexuality and traditional family values, seemed to sense something other in Farley. He couldn't name it yet. The term gay was not in his vocabulary in the way we use it today, but he could smell it. He was obsessed with making Farley into a real man, a rugged American hero. He pushed him to lift weights, to lower the register of his voice, to project a dominance that was completely alien to Farley's gentle nature. It was a form of psychological erasure. Goldwyn was telling him over and over again, "Who you are is not good enough. You must be what I paid for." While Farley was suffocating in this gilded prison, the mechanism of his rescue was already in motion. In 1948, the playwright Arthur Laurents arrived in Hollywood to write the screenplay for Alfred Hitchcock's Rope. If Farley Granger was the perfect victim of the system, Arthur Laurents was its natural predator. Arthur was a battle-hardened New York intellectual who had served in the war and honed a wit that could cut like a razor. Crucially, as a playwright, he owned his copyright and his dignity. He viewed the studio moguls as uneducated tyrants and the stars as tragic, frightened children. He walked through Hollywood with the swagger of a man who answered to no one. Destiny demanded that these two worlds collide. It happened at a party in the Hollywood Hills. Farley was there, numbing his anxiety with a martini, a broken trophy on display. Arthur was observing from across the room. Looking past the movie star facade, he didn't see a celebrity. He saw a hostage. When they left together, retreating to the sanctuary of Arthur's house, the dynamic was set immediately. For the first time, Farley wasn't speaking to a boss who wanted to own him or a fan who wanted to worship him. He was speaking to an equal. As Farley described the lectures, the threats, and the suffocating control of Goldwin, Arthur didn't offer pity. He offered a weapon, perspective. He became the first person to identify the studio contract for what it truly was, not a business deal, but a violation of human rights. In that quiet room, the slavery contract met its greatest threat, a partner who taught the victim how to fight back. But while Arthur Laurents was beginning to liberate Farley's mind, another figure arrived to complicate the narrative. A man who would not liberate Farley, but who would exploit his entrapment with a genius that bordered on the perverse. That man was Alfred Hitchcock. If Samuel Goldwyn was the blunt instrument trying to beat Farley Granger into a shape he didn't fit, Alfred Hitchcock was the surgeon who wanted to dissect him. Hitchcock was already a legend, the master of suspense, but he was also a master of psychology. He didn't want the cardboard cutout heroes that Goldwyn peddled. He was interested in guilt, in anxiety, and in the dark, unspoken desires that lurked beneath the surface of American life. He was looking for a lead actor for his new experimental film, Rope. He didn't want a John Wayne. He needed someone who looked like he had a secret. He needed someone who radiated a beautiful, tragic fragility. He needed Farley Granger. Hitchcock approached Goldwyn to borrow Farley. The transaction was a loan-out deal, typical of the slavery contract system. Goldwyn charged Hitchcock a premium fee for Farley's services, pocketing the profit while Farley continued to receive his standard meager weekly salary. But for Farley, this loan was a reprieve. He was moving from a factory of kitsch to a laboratory of art. Rope, 1948, was a film that existed almost entirely in the niche of the forbidden. Based on the infamous Leopold and Loeb case of 1924, it told the story of two wealthy, brilliant university students who murder a classmate simply to prove they are superior beings, hiding his body in a chest in the middle of their living room while they host a dinner party. In reality, Leopold and Loeb were lovers, a fact that was widely known but legally unspeakable in 1948 due to the Motion Picture Production Code. Hitchcock, however, thrived on the code. He loved the game of showing without showing. He cast Farley Granger as Philip Morgan, the weaker, more sensitive half of the killing duo, opposite John Dowell's dominant, sociopathic Brandon Shaw. Hitchcock essentially directed them to play the characters as a bickering married couple. He tapped into the gay code, the subtle gestures, the intense eye contact, the hysteria, to convey the nature of their relationship without ever saying the word. For Farley, the production of Rope was a trial by fire. Hitchcock had decided to film the movie in a series of 10-minute continuous takes, editing them together to look like one single, uninterrupted shot. This meant there were no cuts to save an actor. If Farley flubbed a line at minute 9, the entire cast and crew had to reset to minute 1. The pressure was excruciating. But Hitchcock used this. He knew Farley was anxious. He knew Farley was terrified of messing up. He channeled that real-life terror into the character of Philip. When you watch Rope and you see Philip Morgan drinking too much, sweating, his hands shaking as he plays the piano, you are not just seeing acting. You are seeing the real psychological state of Farley Granger, weaponized by Hitchcock for the sake of the film. Unlike Goldwyn, who hated Farley's softness, Hitchcock framed it, lit it, and turned it into cinema. He validated the very things Goldwyn tried to destroy. 3 years later, the director and the actor would reunite for a film that would define the niche of the homoerotic noir, Strangers on a Train, 1951. If Rope was about a marriage, Strangers on a Train was about a seduction. The premise was diabolically simple. 2 men meet on a train. One is Guy Haines, Farley, a handsome passive tennis pro trapped in a miserable marriage. The other is Bruno Antony, Robert Walker, a flamboyant, charming psychopath who hates his father. Bruno proposes a crisscross murder. I'll kill your wife. You kill my father. Hitchcock cast Farley as the straight man, but he directed the film as a dark romance. The chemistry between Guy and Bruno is the engine of the movie. Bruno is the id. He is everything Farley's character is afraid to be. He is aggressive, flamboyant, and uninhibited. Hitchcock filled the screen with visual metaphors of their connection. The famous scene where they accidentally kick each other's feet under the table in the club car is filmed with the intimacy of a lover's tryst. The way Bruno stares at Guy is not the stare of a conspirator. It is the stare of a predator circling a mate. Hitchcock understood the golden cage Farley was in, and he put it on screen. Guy Haines is a man trapped by institutions, by marriage, by the law, by politics. He wants to marry a senator's daughter. Bruno offers him a violent, chaotic escape. In many ways, the film mirrored Farley's real life. He was the passive Guy Haines, trapped by Goldwyn, and he was being courted by the dangerous freedom that Arthur Laurents represented. During the filming of these masterpieces, Arthur Laurents was the invisible hand guiding Farley from the shadows. Arthur was often present, not on the soundstage where he might conflict with Hitchcock, but in the evenings, in the quiet of their home. He became Farley's shadow director. He helped Farley analyze the scripts, breaking down the subtext that Hitchcock was implying. Arthur, with his deep understanding of dramatic structure, taught Farley to respect his own craft. But more importantly, Arthur began to inoculate Farley against the toxicity of the industry. When Farley would come home exhausted, terrified that he hadn't been masculine enough for the studio, Arthur would deconstruct the criticism. Hitchcock is using you, Arthur would explain, but he's using the truth. Goldwyn wants a lie. The truth is better. Arthur helped Farley see that his sensitivity was an asset, not a liability. He gave Farley the confidence to stand toe-to-toe with Robert Walker, to hold the screen against the technical wizardry of Hitchcock's camera. The presence of Arthur Laurents during the Hitchcock era created a fascinating triangle. You had Goldwin, the oppressor, who wanted to own Farley's body. You had Hitchcock, the artist who wanted to exploit Farley's psychology. And you had Arthur, the lover who wanted to free Farley's soul. It was during the production of Strangers on a Train that the collision solidified into a permanent bond. Farley realized that the artistic satisfaction he felt with Hitchcock was fleeting. The moment the camera stopped, he was back under Goldwyn's thumb. But the satisfaction he found with Arthur, the intellectual growth, the emotional safety, was sustainable. He began to see that acting and living were two different things. Hitchcock taught him how to be a great victim on screen, but Arthur was teaching him how to stop being a victim in life. As the reviews for Strangers on a Train poured in praising Farley's performance, Goldwyn saw dollar signs. He wanted to push Farley back into the grinder to capitalize on the heat, but he didn't notice the change in his property's eyes. The free bird had tasted the air. The golden cage was still locked, but Farley Granger was no longer looking at the bars. He was looking at the map of Europe that Arthur Laurents had spread out on the kitchen table. The rebellion was no longer a vague dream, it was a scheduled flight. By the dawn of the 1950s, the Cold War was freezing the geopolitical map of the world, locking nations into a stalemate of fear and ideology. But inside the personal life of Farley Granger, a different kind of war was heating up, a war of attrition between the monolithic power of Samuel Goldwyn Productions and the newfound resilience of the actor he claimed to own. The dynamic had fundamentally shifted. Farley was no longer the trembling teenager who had signed his life away in 1943, nor was he the terrified 20-year-old hiding vodka bottles in his dressing room. He was now a man in his mid-20s, battle-hardened by the psychological warfare of the studio lot, and crucially, he was no longer fighting alone. He had Arthur Laurents, a strategist who understood that in a rigged game, the only way to win is to refuse to play. Together they devised a plan to turn Goldwyn's favorite weapon against him. They would take the suspension, the very tool designed to starve Farley into submission, to humble him, to break him, and they would transform it into the ultimate luxury, time. The mechanism of this rebellion was deceptively simple, but it required nerves of steel. In the past, when the studio courier delivered a script to Farley's door, it was a command, not a request. If the script was garbage, a repetitive, formulaic melodrama designed to exploit his looks without challenging his talent, Farley would have previously wept, drank, and then reported to the set, terrified of the consequences of refusal. But now, under Arthur's tutelage, the ritual changed. The script would arrive. Farley would read it. He would see the flatness of the characters, the banality of the dialogue. He would look at Arthur, and then he would pick up the phone and call the front office. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't scream. He would simply say, no. The reaction from Samuel Goldwyn was predictable in its tyranny. He would rage. He would threaten to destroy Farley's career. And then he would pull the lever. The legal department would issue the suspension notice. You are hereby suspended without pay. Goldwyn expected this to be the punishment that brought the boy to his knees. He expected Farley to sit in his rented apartment in Los Angeles, watching his bank account drain, sweating in the smog of anxiety, isolated and shamed, until he came crawling back to apologize. But Goldwyn had miscalculated. He didn't know that the moment the suspension notice hit the doormat, Farley and Arthur were already packing their bags. They didn't stay in Los Angeles to be shamed. They went to the airport. They fled the jurisdiction of the studio entirely, boarding prop planes bound for a world where the name Samuel Goldwyn held no terror, Europe. For a young American man in the early 1950s, stepping onto the soil of France or Italy was like stepping out of a pressurized cabin. Hollywood was a company town, a surveillance state run by gossips and moralists, deeply infected by the paranoia of the McCarthy era. If you were different, if you were un-American, if you were gay, you were a target. But Europe was different. It was a continent still recovering from the ravages of World War II, a place of ruins and reconstruction, but also a place of profound intellectual and sexual freedom. Paris in 1951 was not concerned with the morality clause. In the smoke-filled cafes of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, nobody cared who you slept with. They cared about what you thought. For Farley, the anonymity was intoxicating. For the first time in nearly a decade, he could walk down a boulevard without checking his reflection in a shop window to ensure it met studio standards. He could sit in a bistro with Arthur, their knees touching under the table, without scanning the room for Hedda Hopper's spies. He was not Farley Granger, the movie star. He was just a handsome American tourist traveling with his friend. The relief was physical. The knot of tension that had lived in his chest for 5 years began to loosen. It was during these extended suspensions, periods that sometimes lasted for months, that Arthur Laurents truly took on the role of the architect of Farley's new self. If Goldwin had tried to mold Farley into a product, Arthur sought to mold him into a person. Arthur saw that Farley had been denied an education, not just in academics, but in life. The studio had kept him in a state of arrested development, treating him like a child to be managed. Arthur treated him like a man to be challenged. Arthur became his guide, his professor, and his mentor. He didn't just show Farley the sights, he educated him. They spent days wandering through the Louvre and the Uffizi, not just looking at paintings, but discussing them. Arthur taught Farley how to read a canvas, how to listen to the structure of an opera at La Scala, how to appreciate the architecture of a Roman ruin. He introduced Farley to his circle of friends, writers, poets, artists, expatriates, people who valued ideas over box office receipts. They debated politics, philosophy, and art. Arthur challenged Farley to have opinions, to disagree, to think thoughts that hadn't been scripted by a publicist. This was a process of deprogramming. Arthur was systematically stripping away the layers of insecurity that Goldwyn had implanted in Farley's psyche. Goldwyn's primary method of control was to tell Farley, "You are nothing without the studio. You are just a pretty face." Arthur was proving that to be a lie. In Paris, in Rome, in London, Farley was cultured, he was charming, he was intelligent, and he was loved. Not for his fame, but for himself. He realized that the world was vast, and Hollywood was just a small, neurotic factory in the desert. The glass closet they inhabited in Europe was far more transparent than the suffocating darkness of California. While they still maintained a discreet facade for the general public, they didn't hold hands in the middle of the Piazza San Marco. Within their private circle, they lived openly as a couple. They rented villas in the Italian countryside. They drove a convertible along the winding coastal roads of the Mediterranean, wind in their hair, looking like the heroes of a movie that Hollywood would never dare to make. They experienced a domestic happiness that was strictly criminalized in the United States. They cooked together, they read together, they argued and made up. This period was crucial for the niche of their story because it proved the ineffectiveness of the power harassment. Goldwyn's power relied on the victim's participation. It relied on the victim caring about the punishment. But Farley had stopped caring. The suspension, intended to be a prison sentence, became a honeymoon. Every time Goldwyn tried to punish him, he inadvertently gave Farley and Arthur another vacation. Back in Los Angeles, Samuel Goldwyn was losing his mind. The reports coming back to the studio were baffling. His property was not suffering. His slave was not begging for mercy. Instead, gossip trickled back that Farley Granger was spotted drinking wine in Rome, looking more handsome and relaxed than ever. Goldwyn would send furious cables, telegrams that arrived like missiles, demanding Farley return, threatening legal action, threatening to ruin him, threatening to put him on the blacklist. In the past, these cables would have sent Farley into a panic attack. He would have boarded the first plane back, trembling. Now, with Arthur sitting across from him on a terrace overlooking the Mediterranean, Farley would read the telegrams, laugh, and order another bottle of wine. The balance of power had shifted. Goldwyn was shouting into the void. He had locked the door to the cage, only to realize the bird was already outside, flying higher than he could reach. However, the reality of the slavery contract was still legally binding, and Arthur, ever the pragmatist, reminded Farley of the cost. The toll clause was still ticking, or rather it wasn't. Every month Farley spent in Rome was a month added to the end of his 7-year sentence. He was burning time, but he wasn't gaining freedom. He was merely delaying the inevitable confrontation. By 1952, the tension of this double life had become unsustainable. Farley couldn't live on Arthur's money forever. Arthur was generous, but he wasn't a bank, and Farley's pride chafed at being financially dependent. Moreover, they couldn't run forever. The rebellion had been a success in spirit. It had saved Farley's sanity. But legally, Goldwyn still owned the deed to his professional life. The escapism of Europe had clarified one thing with absolute certainty. Farley could never go back to being the submissive boy Goldwyn wanted. He had tasted too much freedom. He had seen too much beauty. He had lived as a grown man. The next time he walked into Goldwyn's office, he wouldn't be there to apologize for the suspension. He wouldn't be there to beg for a role. He would be there to end it. The European interlude had forged the steel in his spine. It had given him the vision of a life worth fighting for. Now he had to bring that steel back to the ugly transactional reality of Hollywood and use it to cut the chain. The honeymoon was over. The buyout was about to begin. The year was 1953. The sun beat down on the pavement of the Samuel Goldwyn studio lot in West Hollywood, baking the sound stages where illusions were manufactured for mass consumption. But the man walking across the tarmac toward the executive building was no longer an illusion. Farley Granger had returned from Europe, and the atmosphere around him had changed. He was no longer the trembling 20-year-old who hid in dressing rooms to avoid the gaze of his owner. He was 28, tanned from the Italian sun, intellectually sharpened by the salons of Paris, and emotionally fortified by the love of Arthur Laurents. He walked with a different cadence, the heavy, deliberate step of a man who is marching toward his own execution, or perhaps his own emancipation. Farley had come to a realization that terrified most actors, but liberated him. He realized that the worst thing Samuel Goldwyn could do was fire him. And to the new Farley Granger, being fired looked a lot like freedom. The fear that the studio system relied upon, the fear of poverty, the fear of irrelevance, the fear of being cast out of the kingdom, had evaporated in the European air. Farley understood now that there was a world outside of the studio gates, a world of theater, of art, and of real life. He was ready to burn the bridge. The final confrontation took place in Samuel Goldwyn's office, a room designed to intimidate. It was a cavernous space filled with oversized furniture intended to make anyone sitting opposite the mogul feel small, childlike, and dependent. Goldwyn sat behind his massive desk, the emperor of his domain. In the past, this room had been the site of Farley's humiliation, the place where he was lectured on his masculinity and threatened with suspension. But today, the script was flipped. Farley did not sit down. He stood. He looked at the man who had controlled his hair, his clothes, his schedule, and his bank account for a decade. And he issued an ultimatum. He didn't want a raise. He didn't want a better dressing room. He wanted out. Not a suspension, not a hiatus, not a loan out. He demanded a complete and total severance of the contract. He was firing his boss. Goldwin was apoplectic. To a man of his generation and power, this was not just a breach of contract. It was an act of personal treason. He raged. He screamed. He threatened to destroy Farley's reputation to ensure he never worked in this town again, a threat that carried the weight of a death sentence in the insular village of Hollywood. He reminded Farley that he had made him out of nothing, that Farley was merely a pile of clay that Goldwyn had sculpted into a star. But Farley stood his ground. He didn't argue. He simply refused to yield. He was backed by the invisible strength of Arthur Laurents, who was waiting for him at home. Farley knew that he had a safety net that Goldwyn couldn't cut. When the shouting finally died down, Goldwyn, ever the ruthless businessman, looked at Farley and realized the truth. The asset was spoiled. He could no longer control Farley's mind, and an uncontrollable asset was a liability. The slave had learned to read, and he was inciting a rebellion. So, Samuel Goldwyn shifted tactics. If he couldn't own Farley, he would bleed him. He named his price. The terms of the buyout were punitive, vindictive, and designed to inflict maximum pain. Goldwyn agreed to release Farley from the remainder of his 7-year contract, but only if Farley bought his own freedom. The concept was medieval. A serf paying a lord for the right to leave the land. The financial cost was staggering. Farley had to pay Goldwyn a massive lump sum, tens of thousands of dollars, a figure that represented a huge percentage of everything Farley had earned over the last decade. In essence, he was being asked to return the money he had labored for, to buy back the years of his own life. But Goldwyn wasn't finished. He added a kick-in-the-teeth clause. Farley also had to agree to return to the studio at a later date to make one final film for free. No salary, no points, just pure, extracted labor. It was a ransom demand for a human soul. For Farley, who had lived comfortably but not extravagantly, who supported his parents and had no massive investment portfolio, this meant financial ruin. It meant emptying his savings accounts. It meant liquidating his assets. It meant walking away from the biggest machine in show business with barely a dime to his name. It was a terrifying prospect. In Hollywood, money was the only metric of respect. To voluntarily choose bankruptcy was considered an act of insanity. This is the moment where the story would have ended for most actors. They would have folded, apologized, and gone back to work. But Farley Granger had Arthur Laurents. Arthur was the banker of the rebellion, both emotionally and literally. When Farley returned home and explained the extortionate terms, Arthur didn't flinch. He didn't tell Farley to go back and beg. He told him to pay it. Arthur, with his Broadway wealth and his unshakable belief in Farley's talent, stood as the guarantor of their future. He assured Farley that money was a renewable resource, but dignity was not. If you stay, Arthur argued, you will die inside. If you pay, you will be broke, but you will be free. With Arthur's hand on his shoulder, Farley wrote the check. He signed the papers. In a singular quiet act of defiance that reverberated through the whispered networks of the industry, Farley Granger purchased the copyright to his own body. He walked out of the studio gates into the bright California sun, no longer a Goldwyn girl, no longer a starlet, no longer a piece of property. He was a sovereign man. He was broke, he was labeled difficult, and he was free. The retribution from the industry was swift and cold. The phone stopped ringing. The studio heads, acting in unspoken solidarity with Goldwyn, viewed Farley as a traitor to the system. He was a troublemaker, a man who didn't know his place. The invitations to Kiro's and the Brown Derby dried up. The gossip columns, once filled with his name, went silent or turned sour. Farley Granger had exiled himself from the kingdom. But just as the door to Hollywood slammed shut, a window in Europe threw itself open, as if the universe was rewarding his courage. Almost immediately after the buyout, Farley received a phone call. It wasn't from a studio hack in Burbank. It was from Luchino Visconti. Visconti was Italian royalty, a count by birth, a Marxist by choice, and an openly gay director of immense artistic prestige. He was the antithesis of Samuel Goldwyn. He didn't make products, he made operas on film, he was casting a new masterpiece, Senso, and he didn't want a puppet. He wanted an actor who understood pain, beauty, and corruption. He offered Farley the lead role. The transition was jarring in its perfection. Farley packed his bags again, this time not as a runaway, but as a hired artist. He flew to Venice in 1954 to begin filming. Senso was the artistic redemption that validated Farley's sacrifice. Visconti cast him as Lieutenant Franz Mahler, a beautiful, morally corrupt Austrian officer who seduces an Italian countess, played by Alida Valli, for her money only to betray her. It was a complex, dark, sophisticated role that required depth and nuance, qualities Goldwyn had spent 10 years trying to suppress in favor of bland heroism. On the set of Senso, Farley was treated with a reverence he had never experienced in Hollywood. He was not shouted at. He was not told to butch up. Visconti, who was known for his exacting standards, directed Farley with a mixture of rigorous demand and deep respect. The director saw the same queer energy that Hitchcock had seen, the narcissism, the fragility, the beauty, and he utilized it to create a character of tragic dimensions. Arthur Laurents was there too. He joined Farley in Venice, and they lived in a palazzo, surrounded by the history and culture that Arthur had taught Farley to love. The contrast was blinding. In Hollywood, Farley had to pay a ransom to escape. In Europe, he was being paid to create art. In Hollywood, his homosexuality was a shameful secret to be beaten out of him. In Visconti's world, it was an understood part of the artistic temperament. The filming of Senso was the climax of the niche. It exposed the great lie of the studio system, the idea that actors were nothing without the machine. Farley Granger proved that the machine needed the actors more than the actors needed the machine. He had stripped himself of his financial security to regain his autonomy, a trade that few in history had dared to make. As the cameras rolled in the opulent ballrooms of Venice, capturing Farley in his Technicolor prime, looking more handsome, more dangerous, and more alive than he ever had in a Goldwyn picture, it was clear that he had not just survived the slavery contract. He had outgrown it. He had successfully transitioned from being a piece of property to being an artist. He had paid the price, and now he was reaping the reward. He was coming home to himself. The final act of the Farley Granger and Arthur Laurents story does not take place under the blinding Klieg lights of a movie premiere, nor does it unfold on the sterile, soundproofed stages of a Hollywood lot. It takes place in the chaotic, gritty, and fiercely authentic canyons of New York City. After the financial bloodletting of the buyout in 1953 and the artistic triumph of Senso in 1954, Farley Granger made a choice that baffled the Hollywood establishment and terrified his agents. He chose to be a mortal man. He packed his trunks, turned his back on the mansions of Beverly Hills, and moved to Manhattan to live with Arthur Laurents. Moving to Manhattan represented more than a change of address. It was a defection from one ideology to another. In Los Angeles, Farley was a star, a celestial object to be gazed at, owned, and managed. In New York, he became an actor, a craftsman who worked for a living. The distinction was vital. The golden cage of Samuel Goldwyn was thousands of miles away, rusting in the California sun, while Farley and Arthur began the messy, complicated, and beautiful work of building a life together that was defined by their own rules, not by a morality clause. In the mid-1950s, New York City was the intellectual capital of the world, and for a gay couple, it offered a specific kind of sanctuary known as the glass closet. This was a transparent secrecy. Unlike Hollywood, where gay men were forced into sham marriages with lesbians to satisfy the studio heads, the theater world of New York operated on a policy of sophisticated discretion. Everyone knew, but nobody said. Farley and Arthur lived together openly. They threw dinner parties for Leonard Bernstein, Stephen Sondheim, and Jerome Robbins. They walked down Fifth Avenue together. They were an institution. They were Farley and Arthur, a single entity respected not for their ability to hide, but for their refusal to apologize. For Farley, this period was a second education. Having bought his freedom, he was determined to prove he deserved it. He did something that Goldwyn would have forbidden. He went back to school. He enrolled in the Actors Studio, the temple of the method, studying under Lee Strasberg. He stood in dusty rehearsal rooms, stripping away the polished artificial mannerisms of the movie star to find the raw, ugly truth of the character. He wanted to be taken seriously, and slowly the industry began to oblige. He appeared on Broadway. He starred in live television dramas during the golden age of TV. He never regained the stratospheric, blinding fame he held in 1950, the kind of fame that requires total submission to the machine. But he gained something far more valuable. He gained his face back. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw Samuel Goldwyn's investment. He saw Farley Granger. Meanwhile, Arthur Laurents was ascending to the peak of his powers. Free from the stupidity of Hollywood producers, Arthur wrote the book for West Side Story and Gypsy, reshaping the American musical theater. The dynamic of their relationship shifted beautifully. In the beginning, Arthur had been the protector and the teacher. Now they were equals. They were partners in art and in life. They bought houses together. A beach house in the Hamptons where they could escape the city heat. They traveled the world, not as fugitives running out a suspension, but as successful men enjoying the fruits of their labor. However, the legacy of love was not a sanitized fairy tale. To paint it as such would be a disservice to the niche of reality they fought for. Their relationship was volatile, passionate, and incredibly complex. They fought scream matches that shook the walls. They broke up and reunited. They navigated the difficult terrain of non-monogamy in an era before there was a language for it. They had other lovers, other flings, but the gravitational pull always brought them back to the center. They were the anchors of each other's lives. In a world that told them their love was a sickness, a crime, or a sin, the sheer act of staying together for decade after decade was a radical political statement. As the years rolled on, the contrast between Farley's fate and the fate of his Hollywood contemporaries became stark. Rock Hudson, another giant of the era, remained in the closet, terrified of exposure, until his tragic death from AIDS sparked a global conversation. Montgomery Clift, tortured by his secrets, destroyed himself with alcohol and pills. But Farley Granger survived. He survived because he left. He survived because he refused to let the studio system hollow him out. He survived because he had Arthur. The true weight of their story lies in the context of the niche they fought against, the system of ownership and power harassment. In today's era of #MeToo and the reckoning with abuse in the entertainment industry, the story of Farley and Arthur serves as a pioneering prologue. They were fighting these battles in 1948, long before there was a hashtag, long before there was a support group. Farley Granger was one of the first major stars to publicly say that his mental health, his personal dignity, and his sexual identity were worth more than a studio contract. He proved that an actor could defy a tycoon like Samuel Goldwyn and live to tell the tale. He proved that the threat of the blacklist was a paper tiger if you had enough talent and enough courage to walk away. They proved that the slavery contract could legally bind a man's labor, but it could not bind his heart. The end of their story is perhaps the most poignant script of all. They grew old together, transforming from the golden boy and the wolf into two elderly gentlemen, still bickering, still laughing, sitting in their Manhattan apartment surrounded by a lifetime of memories. On March 27, 2011, Farley Granger died of natural causes in New York at the age of 85. He had lived a full, rich life, writing a memoir, Include Me Out, that finally told his side of the story with brutal honesty. He had won. He had beaten the system. But the story didn't end there. Arthur Laurents, the tough, cynical, invincible playwright who had battled studios, critics, and directors for 93 years, could not survive the silence of the house. He had been the savior, the one who pulled Farley out of the cage, but in the end, Farley was the one who made Arthur's life whole. On May 5, 2011, less than 6 weeks after Farley's death, Arthur Laurents passed away. It was as if the final curtain could not fall on one without the other. They exited the stage almost simultaneously, leaving behind a silence that was deafening. They died as they had lived for over half a century, inextricably linked. In the dusty archives of Hollywood legal departments, the contracts of Samuel Goldwyn are now just yellowing paper, relics of a cruel and vanished empire. The movies remain flickering on screens, capturing the ghost of Farley's youth. But the true legacy of Farley Granger and Arthur Laurents is not on celluloid. It is in the triumph of their survival. They escaped the factory to build a home. They rejected the script written by a tyrant to write their own ending. And in doing so, they left behind the greatest role of their lives, themselves.